The garage lights buzzed on after dark, dust frozen in the air. The ranch held its breath as I worked past my shift, alone. No fights, no slammed doors, just silence. Some people don't argue with family not from weakness, but strategy. They count favors, debts, time. And when silence turns into leverage, everything breaks the moment they stop paying. The Collins Ranch runs on routines: morning dust, afternoon heat, tools lined up where they're supposed to be, nothing fancy, nothing broken enough to fix. From the outside, it looks like stability. And that's usually where these stories begin. I was the only one with a paycheck that didn't fluctuate with seasons or excuses. Every 2 weeks, the deposit came in, same amount, same day. I didn't talk about it. I just worked. I worked early. I worked late. And when I was done with my actual job, I worked some more. Most nights, that meant sitting in the garage with a tablet balanced on a workbench, finishing reports while the ranch settled into silence. The hum of old equipment, the faint click of cooling metal, the kind of quiet that feels earned. No one ever thanked me for that quiet. They just got used to it. My parents liked to say I was the reliable one. They said it like a compliment. What they meant was, I didn't need watching. Logan needed watching. Logan was the one with potential. That was the word they used. Potential. He had ideas, plans, phases. None of them ever seemed to last long enough to pay a bill, but they were always convincing in the moment. When something didn't work out, there was always a reason. The timing was off. The market wasn't ready. The partner bailed. Someone else dropped the ball. And every explanation came with the same unspoken conclusion: this wasn't really his fault. So the system adjusted around him. If money was tight, it was because Logan was in transition. If the ranch needed cash, it was because Logan just needed a little more runway. If something went unpaid, it was temporary. Everything was temporary, except my role. I wasn't in transition. I wasn't finding myself. I wasn't building anything exciting enough to protect. I was stable. And in a lot of families, stable doesn't mean safe. It means available. I paid attention to details because no one else did. Which bills came first? Which ones could wait? How long the checking account could breathe before it started to feel tight? I didn't announce those calculations. I didn't sit anyone down. I just adjusted. That's how you become invisible. Not by disappearing, but by functioning too well. Logan talked about the future. I handled the present. He stayed up late scrolling, sketching ideas, talking about what was coming next. I stayed up late closing spreadsheets, making sure what already existed didn't collapse. No one called that imbalance unfair. They called it family. There's a quiet hierarchy in households like this. It doesn't get written down, but everyone knows it. The one who needs the most gets protected. The one who asks for the least gets used. I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because arguing never changed the math. When something broke, it got fixed. When a payment came due, it got covered. When someone needed help, it showed up. And the more consistently you show up, the more your absence becomes unthinkable. That's the trap. Stability creates dependency. Dependency gets mistaken for entitlement, and entitlement starts to sound like expectation. I started noticing how often decisions were made without me. Not big ones, small ones. Assumptions, quiet reallocations, plans that included my resources but not my voice. No one asked if I was okay with it. They didn't need to. I had never said no. And here's the part most people recognize but don't like admitting: nothing felt urgent enough to leave. There was no screaming match, No dramatic betrayal anyone else could point to and say, "That's when it all went wrong." There were just patterns. Repetition, the slow normalization of imbalance. Logan failed upward, cushioned by explanations. I succeeded quietly, absorbed by responsibility. When people hear stories like this, they always ask the same question: why didn't you just leave? The honest answer is simple: because everything was manageable. Bills were paid, the ranch was still standing. No one had crossed a line that was obvious enough to justify walking away without guilt. That's how these systems survive. They don't break you all at once. They rely on your tolerance for not that bad. I told myself the same things everyone does. It's family. It's temporary. It's easier to stay than explain. And as long as I stayed, the system worked. For everyone else, by the end of most days, I would shut down my screen, turn off the lights, and lock up the garage. One clean motion, no hesitation, no ceremony. I'd tell myself the same thing I'd been telling myself for years. It's fine. It's not perfect, but it's fine. It's not bad enough to leave. And for a long time, that felt true. Until it didn't. 3 days after I told myself it was not bad enough to leave, the first request showed up. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a threat. It came dressed up like a favor. My mom caught me at the kitchen counter while I was rinsing dust off my hands. She didn't look angry. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked practical, like she was asking me to pick up milk on the way home. "We're just a little short this month," she said. "Can you cover the water bill? I didn't ask how we were short." The ranch had been here longer than I had. Bills weren't new. I nodded. Because it was a bill. Because it was a month. Because it sounded temporary. That's how it starts. Not with theft. With phrasing. A few days later, it was my dad. He waited until we were alone in the garage, the air smelling like oil and heat. The door half open like it was a private conversation, even though the whole ranch could hear us. "I hate to ask you," he said, "but the equipment payment is due. Just this once." Just this once is a powerful sentence. It makes you feel like a hero for agreeing. It makes you feel like a villain for hesitating. So I paid. And nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. No one thanked me, but no one panicked either. The system absorbed my money the way dry ground absorbs water. Fast. Quiet. Like it had been waiting. A week later, my mom said the grocery budget needed a reset. My dad said the electric bill was higher because of the heat. And every time they asked, the request came with a soft reassurance, like a hand on the shoulder. "We'll balance it out next month. This is just until things stabilize. You're the only one we can count on." That last line landed the deepest, because it wasn't a compliment. It was a designation. They weren't saying I was loved. They were saying I was usable. Logan was never in the room when these conversations happened. That was another pattern. The burden moved quietly. The beneficiary stayed clean. When Logan did show up, he brought noise. He brought enthusiasm. He brought the kind of confidence that only exists when you're not the one paying. He'd walk in with a new plan and a new tone. Like the ranch was a stage and he was rehearsing a comeback. "I'm close." He'd say, "I've got something lined up." Lined up was his favorite phrase. Sometimes it was a business idea. Sometimes it was a brand partnership. Sometimes it was a job he didn't want, but might take for now. And my parents listened like he was delivering a sermon. They'd nod. They'd encourage. They'd soften. When Logan spoke, they became gentle. When I spoke, they became logistical. I watched it happen in real time. Logan would mention that he needed new boots for a job site he hadn't been hired for yet. And my mom would immediately start talking about quality and comfort, about how important it was to invest in his future. Then my dad would glance at me and say, almost casually, "We might need a little help this month." No explanation, no numbers, just the assumption that I understood my role. I started hearing their requests in pairs. Logan needs something. We're short on something. Logan is starting over. We need a bridge. Logan is in a phase. We need support. And the word we did a lot of work, because we made it sound like I was part of the decision, like I was standing on the same side of the problem, but I wasn't. I was the solution. The requests didn't get bigger all at once. They got more frequent. 100 here, 200 there. A temporary transfer that wasn't returned. I'd open my banking app and see the same pattern money leaving my account in neat, controlled lines. Like I was funding a project. Like I was maintaining a machine. And in a way, I was maintaining the machine that kept Logan comfortable. If you've ever been the stable one in a chaotic family, you know this part. They don't take everything in one day. They take it in increments you can survive. They take it at a pace that lets you keep telling yourself you're fine, because as long as you're fine, they don't have to change. The moral pressure came next. It wasn't shouted. It was suggested. My mom would sigh and say, "Your father's been under so much stress." My dad would say, "We're doing our best. Mara, you know that." And then, the closer, "If you don't help us," my mom said one night, "I don't know what happens to this place. This place didn't just mean the ranch. It meant their identity, their reputation. Their story about being a family that made it. They didn't say, 'We made choices that put us here.' They didn't say, 'We need to make changes.' They said, 'We need you.' They made my support feel like the final pillar holding everything up. And Logan stayed at the center of it without ever touching the weight. If I tried to bring him up, even gently, my mom would move the conversation like a chess piece. Logan is trying. Logan is sensitive right now. Logan has been through a lot. My dad would add, "He just needs time." Time was another word that didn't cost them anything. Time didn't come out of their accounts. Time didn't show up on their statements. My money did. I began to notice how quickly temporary becomes normal. The first time I paid a bill, it felt like a favor. The third time, it felt like a responsibility. By the 10th time, it felt like a requirement. And here's what makes it so hard to walk away at this stage. Nothing had happened that would look obvious on the outside. No bruises, no broken windows, no screaming neighbor calling the cops, just a slow transfer of ownership. My time, my savings, my peace. People imagine financial abuse as someone snatching your wallet. In families like mine, it looks like someone handing you a receipt and calling it love. I didn't snap. I didn't throw a fit. I kept paying. I kept telling myself the same sentence, because it let me breathe. It's not that bad. It's just a rough patch. It's family. And as long as I could still function, I didn't have a clean reason to stop. Everything still looked manageable, which is exactly why it worked. 2 weeks after the temporary requests became routine, I stopped trying to understand them emotionally, because emotions don't balance numbers. They just make you tolerate them. It was a Thursday afternoon when I noticed it. The kind of day where the heat sits on the ranch like a weight, and everything moves slower because the air feels thick. My dad was in the yard, tightening bolts on a piece of equipment that hadn't run properly in months. My mom was inside, moving through the house with that quiet, efficient energy she used when she didn't want questions. And Logan was Logan, somewhere between sleeping in and planning a comeback. I went to the garage to grab a wrench, and my eyes landed on a stack of mail sitting by the old filing cabinet. Envelopes, statements, a couple of unopened notices. Nothing looked urgent. That was the problem. Urgency is obvious. This wasn't. This was just paperwork doing what paperwork always does, showing up, waiting, collecting. I slid the mail into a neat pile and opened the cabinet. The drawer stuck for a second, then gave way with a dry scrape, like it hadn't been touched in a while. Inside were folders labeled in my mom's handwriting: ranch taxes, insurance, utilities, refinance. That last one didn't belong there in my mind. Refinance is the kind of word people mention out loud. I pulled the folder and sat down on the edge of the workbench. The garage smelled like dust and old rubber. The light above me buzzed faintly. I flipped through the pages slowly, not because I was scared, but because I'd learned that speed makes you miss things. There were contracts, account summaries, a schedule of payments, numbers that looked clean, too clean. I didn't feel anything dramatic, no sudden panic, no cinematic moment. I just felt focused, because this wasn't about whether my parents were trying their best. This wasn't about whether Logan needed time. This was about structure, and structure leaves traces. I pulled out my tablet and opened a notes app. Then I opened my banking app. Then, quietly, I opened a spreadsheet, not because I was planning revenge, because I was tired of guessing. A minute later, my mom walked into the garage. She saw the folder in my hands and stopped like she'd hit an invisible line. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was careful. I looked up and said, "Just trying to understand what I'm paying for." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's complicated," she said. "Don't worry about it. Your father is handling it." That sentence should have reassured me. Instead, it clarified something. When people tell you not to worry, what they usually mean is don't look. I nodded. I closed the folder. I put it back. Not because I believed her, because I didn't need to argue. That's the part people get wrong about power. They think it lives in the loudest voice. They think it belongs to the person who slams the table first. But real power doesn't show up in a fight. It shows up in preparation. It shows up when you stop trying to win an emotional conversation and start collecting facts that don't care who's upset. That night, I waited until the ranch went quiet. The sun dropped behind the dry hills. The wind died down. The last engine noise faded. My parents went to bed. Logan's door shut. I clicked the garage lights back on, and I didn't feel heroic. I felt methodical. I pulled the refinance folder back out. I laid the papers across the workbench like I was setting up a clean workspace for a job that required precision. One document referenced an account number I didn't recognize. Another listed payment amounts that didn't match the temporary gaps my mom kept talking about. And then I noticed something small. A date. A refinance doesn't happen accidentally. It happens at a specific time, for a specific reason. This one had been initiated months ago. Months. Which meant the shortfalls weren't sudden. They weren't new. They were being managed. Managed by shifting weight onto me. I opened my laptop and started pulling my own records, transfers, bill payments. The just this once moments that had turned into a pattern. I didn't label them with feelings. I labeled them with dates. April, May, June. Each one a quiet step. I built the timeline like I build a data set. Because that's how you stop being confused. You stop telling yourself stories. You start tracking reality. At 11:17 p.m., I found a receipt for a payment I didn't remember authorizing. It wasn't huge. Just enough to slide under the radar, the kind of amount a person can justify as helping. At 11:41 p.m., I found a confirmation email sent to my dad's address, but listing my phone number as a contact. At 12:06 a.m., I realized my name appeared in places it shouldn't, not as a family member, as a responsible party. That's when the air in the garage felt different. Not tense, not heavy, clear. Because the moment you see your name on a document connected to debt, something shifts inside you. Not emotionally, structurally. It's like realizing the building you've been living in doesn't have a foundation. It's been resting on you. I didn't wake anyone up. I didn't storm into the house. I just kept going, page by page, line by line. I heard the old myth in my head, the one people repeat like it's wisdom. The one who talks the most has the most power. But on that workbench, with those papers, I understood the opposite. Power comes late. It comes after you've done the boring work no one claps for. It comes when you have enough information that you don't need to convince anyone. You can simply present reality, and reality doesn't negotiate. By the time the clock hit 1:30 a.m., I had a file on my desktop with scanned documents, screenshots, and notes. Not a rant, not a diary entry, a record. I turned off my laptop, stood up, and locked the garage. The remote clicked in my hand. The door rolled down with a low mechanical groan, sealing the night in. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd finally stopped bleeding in the dark. And for the first time, I wasn't just enduring the system, I was studying it. By the time I started tracking the paperwork, I already had a pattern. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a sequence. On Monday, my mom would mention a short month. On Wednesday, my dad would ask for a bridge. By Friday, Logan would appear with a fresh need that somehow aligned perfectly with the gap they'd been describing. It was consistent enough to be measurable, so I measured it. I built a folder on my desktop and named it something boring. Ranch Admin. Not because I was hiding it, because boring files get ignored. I started scanning documents after everyone went to bed. I photographed envelopes. I saved PDFs. I labeled everything with dates. Not dramatic titles, just facts. June 14th, electric statement. June 18th, equipment payment notice. June 22, refinance summary. Facts don't argue back. They just sit there. 2 nights later, I found the first number that didn't fit. A payment schedule listed monthly amounts that were higher than what my parents said we were short. Not by a little. By enough that rough patch stopped making sense. I didn't react. I recalculated. I pulled up my bank transfers and cross-checked them against the dates in the folder. That was when I noticed something else. The withdrawals weren't random. They were timed. My help always arrived right before a due date. That meant they weren't asking because they were surprised. They were asking because they knew exactly what was coming. And if they knew what was coming, then they weren't drowning. They were budgeting. They were reallocating. They were using my stability like a line item. I flipped through another set of pages and saw a document titled, with the ranch property description and a lender's name I didn't recognize. The language was dense. The type was small. The kind of document designed to make people stop reading. I didn't stop. I traced the terms with my finger. I highlighted clauses. I searched phrases online to confirm definitions. And then I saw it. My name. Not as Mara Collins. Daughter. Not as Mara, who helps out. As a responsible party, I stared at it for a full minute. No blinking, no spiraling, just verification, because my brain didn't want to accept it. So I made it prove itself twice. I checked the header, I checked the account number, I checked the signature page. My signature was there. It wasn't mine. It looked close enough to fool a glance, close enough to slide past someone who trusted the people holding the pen, But I've signed my name thousands of times. On legal forms, on contracts, on documents that determine whether you can rent an apartment or buy a car or keep your life intact. I knew my signature the way you know your own voice. And this one wasn't it. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I opened a new tab and pulled up my credit report. Then another. Then another. If you've never done that before, let me tell you there is a special kind of cold that settles in your chest when you realize your identity can be used like a tool in someone else's story. I found an account listed that I hadn't opened, a contact number that wasn't mine, addresses that matched the ranch. Everything pointed back to the same place, the house, the land, the people who called me family. I saved screenshots. I exported the report. I created backups. Because in that moment, I stopped being a daughter trying to be understood. I became a person protecting her name. The next morning, I didn't say anything. My mom poured coffee like usual. My dad talked about the weather like the weather mattered more than what I'd found. Logan walked in late, hair messy, confidence intact. He grabbed something from the fridge and said, "Morning," like we were a normal family. I looked at him, and I realized something that made my stomach go still. He wasn't nervous. People who don't know they've done something wrong have a kind of innocence in their posture. Logan didn't have that. He had ease. The kind of ease you get when you believe consequences are for other people. That night, I didn't go back to the refinance folder first. I went to email. I searched Logan's name. I searched keywords: loan, paperwork, signature, help. I didn't expect to find much, if he was careless. He wasn't careless in writing. But then I saw an old thread from months back buried under promotional newsletters and random updates. It was a short message Logan had sent to my mom, and my mom had forwarded to my dad. And because the family shared accounts the way they shared boundaries, the message ended up in an inbox I could access through the ranch admin login. It was one line. He wrote, "Mara won't make a big deal out of it." That was it. No apology, no doubt, no fear, just confidence. Not confidence in himself, confidence in me, in my silence, in my conditioning, in the years of me being the one who kept things from falling apart. That one sentence did something the forged signature couldn't. It removed the last possibility of misunderstanding. This wasn't a messy mistake. This wasn't a desperate choice made in panic. This was a decision made with the assumption that I would tolerate it. And when you realize someone is betting on your tolerance, the temperature inside you changes. Not hot, not emotional, cold. Because cold is what happens when the story stops being about feelings and becomes about facts. I printed the email. I printed the contract. I printed the credit report pages. I stacked them neatly. Then I went to the garage door and pressed the remote. The metal rolled down with its familiar groan. The sound was steady, predictable, unlike the people inside the house. I didn't sleep much after that. Not because I was panicking, because I was planning. There's a difference. Panic makes noise. Planning makes lists. And that night, I made mine. What I had. What I needed. Who I could call. What I could prove. I didn't feel heartbreak in the way people expect. I felt clarity. Because once you see the evidence, you don't have to argue with anyone's emotions anymore. You just have to decide what you're willing to protect. And for the first time in a long time, the answer wasn't the ranch. It was me. I didn't confront anyone the next day. I went to work. I answered emails. I joined meetings. I used my normal voice. Because the moment you realize someone is using your name like a tool, you stop treating the situation like a family disagreement. You treat it like a boundary breach. That night, I sat in the garage again with the documents spread across the workbench, and I kept coming back to the same thought. This was the part people don't talk about. Everyone loves the clean ending, the dramatic exit, the perfect line you deliver before you shut the door. But most of us don't leave because we have a headline-worthy reason. Most of us leave because we've been worn down in ways that don't show up on paper. And that's what made this so dangerous. The forged signature, the loan language, the numbers. They were real, they were serious. But they also created a trap that sounds like this. Well, my family hasn't done that, so maybe I don't have the right to leave. I want to pause here, because if you're listening to this and you feel that thought in your chest, you're not alone. A lot of people are living inside a quiet bargain. They've been trained to believe that love is proven through endurance, that loyalty is measured by what you're willing to tolerate, that leaving is only justified if the damage is obvious enough to explain to strangers. But you do not need a crime to justify your boundaries. You don't need a forged document to prove that you're allowed to step away. Most unhealthy systems don't escalate into something dramatic. They stay right below the surface. They stay in the gray, because gray is easier to survive. And because gray keeps you uncertain. Gray keeps you asking, am I overreacting? Gray keeps you negotiating with your own instincts. Here's what I learned staring at those papers. I didn't stay because I was stupid. I stayed because the harm was incremental. It wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 small moments that never felt serious enough. One bill, one transfer, one conversation where your needs get labeled as selfish, one apology you never receive because no one thinks they did anything wrong. And over time, you start building your life around their comfort. You shrink your expectations. You lower your standards. You become grateful for basic respect. That is not love. That is conditioning. And if you've been conditioned to feel guilty for protecting yourself, you will always wait for a bigger reason. You'll tell yourself you need proof. You'll tell yourself you need permission. You'll tell yourself you need the story to be bad enough that no one can question you. But let me say this clearly. You don't need permission to stop being used. You don't need an audience to validate your decision. You don't need to be hurt in the worst way imaginable to be allowed to choose safety. If someone only treats you well when you're useful, that's not a relationship. That's a transaction. And if the price of staying is your peace, your health, your future, then staying isn't noble. It's expensive. What happened to me had paperwork attached to it. So it was easier to name. It was easier to point to a line on a page and say, this is wrong. But some of you are living in situations where the wrongness isn't stamped and signed. It's subtle. It's the way your family makes you feel like you owe them for being born. It's the way you're expected to be the strong one at your own expense. It's the way your boundaries get treated like betrayal. And you keep thinking, it's not that bad. That sentence is a cage. Because if you wait until it's unbearable, you will lose years you can't get back. There's a difference between being patient and being trapped. Patience has an end point. Trapped feels endless. The moment you start asking yourself whether you're allowed to leave is usually the moment you already know you should. Leaving doesn't always look like slamming a door. Sometimes leaving is quiet. Sometimes it's you opening a new bank account. Sometimes it's you stopping the transfers. Sometimes it's you moving your important documents out of the house. Sometimes it's you telling yourself the truth in a sentence you've avoided for years. I can love them and still refuse this system. That's not cruelty. That's maturity. And if you've never been told this before, let me be the one to tell you now. You are not required to stay in a situation that is slowly draining you just because the people doing it share your last name. Blood doesn't cancel boundaries. Love doesn't erase accountability. And survival does not need anyone's approval. That night, I stacked the papers into a clean pile and slid them into a folder. Not because I needed more drama, because I needed a decision. I wasn't waiting for it to get worse. I was done paying for permission to leave. People keep asking me one question: do you hate Logan? They expect a clean answer, a villain, someone to blame, so the story feels finished. But the truth is quieter than that. I didn't grow up with a brother who woke up one day and decided to be entitled. I grew up inside a system that trained him never to feel the ground. Logan was the child everyone protected from consequences. When he failed a class, it was because the teacher didn't understand him. When he quit a job, it was because the environment wasn't right. When money disappeared, it was because he's still figuring things out. There was always a reason. There was always a buffer. And when a system cushions you long enough, you stop learning how to stand. That doesn't make him innocent, but it explains something important. Golden children are not raised to be accountable. They are raised to be preserved. From the outside, it looks like privilege. From the inside, it looks like exemption. They're exempt from discomfort, exempt from consequences, exempt from urgency, and every exemption has a cost. Someone else absorbs it. In our family, that someone was me, not because I was weaker, because I was reliable. Stability attracts extraction. When you are consistent, people build plans around you without asking. When you don't explode, people assume you won't. When you keep showing up, others stop worrying about showing up at all. Logan didn't need to become responsible. The system had already decided I would be. That's why the question, is the golden child innocent, is the wrong one. Innocence suggests ignorance. This wasn't ignorance. It was insulation. Logan knew just enough to know he'd be protected. He didn't need to know details. He didn't need to read contracts. All he needed to know was that someone else would handle it, and someone did. That's how systems like this survive. Not through malice, through avoidance. People ask why I don't scream at him, why I don't demand remorse. Because rage would give him a role he never earned. This isn't a story about a bad brother. It's a story about what happens when families confuse love with shielding. When parents protect one child from reality, they don't just fail that child. They transfer the weight. They move responsibility sideways. They turn another child into infrastructure. I don't need Logan to be a monster for what happened to be wrong. I don't need him to admit guilt for the system to be unjust. Understanding this didn't soften what he did. It clarified it. It showed me that waiting for him to change would be pointless. Because the system didn't require his growth. It required my compliance. That's a hard thing to accept. Because anger is easier than clarity. Anger lets you believe that if the other person were different, things could be fixed. Clarity forces you to see that the structure itself is broken. And broken structures don't respond to emotional appeals. They respond to boundaries. I didn't leave because I stopped loving my family. I left because I stopped confusing my usefulness with my worth. Logan didn't steal my future by himself. He stepped into a role that was already prepared for him. And I stepped out of mine. If you're listening to this and you grew up as the responsible one, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not failing anyone by refusing to be the buffer anymore. You are not cruel for stepping away from a system that only functions when you absorb the damage. And the golden child in your life doesn't need your punishment. They need reality. And reality is not something you can force onto someone by staying. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is remove the cushion, not out of spite, out of truth. I don't need Logan to fall apart to justify my decision. I don't need him to finally understand. My leaving wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It was about ending my own. The lesson where I learned to disappear so others could remain comfortable. That lesson ends here. There's a phrase people use to shut down hard conversations, but their family, it sounds gentle. It sounds moral. What it really does is remove accountability. For a long time, I believed love and responsibility were the same thing. If you loved someone, you absorbed the cost. If you didn't, you were selfish. That belief kept me quiet longer than anything else. Because when harm comes from strangers, we call it what it is. When it comes from family, we rename it. We call it sacrifice. We call it misunderstanding. We call it loyalty. But here's the truth I had to learn the hard way. Family is not a legal blind spot. It's not an ethical exception. And it's not a moral free pass. Love explains behavior. It does not excuse it. I didn't realize how dangerous that confusion was until I started laying everything out side by side. On one page, the story we told ourselves. We're doing our best. It's just temporary. We're all in this together. On the other page, the structure. Who signed what? Who paid what? Who carried the risk? The two didn't match. And when story and structure don't align, the structure always tells the truth. That's when I understood something bigger than my own situation. Most people don't get hurt by bad intentions. They get hurt by unexamined systems. Families are systems. They have rules, spoken or not. They have roles. They have rewards and penalties. And when those systems are unfair, they don't correct themselves out of love. They correct themselves when someone refuses to keep the imbalance in place. That's what adulthood actually is. Not rebellion, not revenge, structure. Adulthood is the moment you stop asking, what will keep the peace, and start asking, what is sustainable? Because peace built on one person absorbing all the damage isn't peace. It's postponement. I loved my parents. That was never in question. But love doesn't mean pretending harm isn't happening. Love doesn't mean letting your name be used without consent. Love doesn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep a system warm. When people hear that, they get uncomfortable. They say things like, "But shouldn't family be different?" Yes, family should be better. Better doesn't mean less accountable. It means more. If a stranger had done what was done to me, there would be no debate, no emotional gymnastics, no pressure to forgive before understanding. The only reason it felt complicated was because we confuse closeness with exemption. But responsibility doesn't disappear just because the relationship is personal. If anything, it matters more. That's the line most people never cross. They think holding family accountable means destroying the relationship. In reality, avoiding accountability is what erodes it. Because resentment grows in silence, trust dies in ambiguity, and systems that rely on one person's endurance eventually collapse anyway. The difference is who they collapse on. I didn't stop loving my family when I chose structure. I stopped lying to myself. I stopped pretending that affection replaces consent, that history replaces boundaries, that intention replaces impact. And that shift didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. Clear enough to see that fairness is not cruelty, that limits are not abandonment, that saying no to a broken system is not a personal attack. It's maintenance. This is the part I want you to hear, especially if you've been raised to carry more than your share. You are not betraying your family by asking for fairness. You are not dramatic for wanting clarity. You are not heartless for refusing to be the financial or emotional shock absorber. Wanting structure doesn't mean you love less. It means you understand what love requires to survive. Families don't fall apart because someone finally draws a line. They fall apart because lines were never allowed in the first place. And maturity isn't choosing sides. It's choosing systems that don't require one person to disappear for everyone else to function. That's what I chose. Not punishment, not revenge. Balance. Because family doesn't mean no rules. Family means the rules matter enough to protect everyone, including you. Leaving is not the hardest part. That surprises people. They imagine the hard part is the confrontation, the paperwork, the final decision, the dramatic moment where you choose yourself. But for me, the hardest part came after. It came in the quiet. A week after I stopped sending money, I woke up before sunrise out of habit. Not because anyone needed me, because my body didn't know the system had ended. The ranch was still there. Technically, the dust still moved in the wind, the same dry horizon, the same long stretch of silence. But my role was gone. And when you've spent years being a role, losing it feels strange. Freedom doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like emptiness, because when you stop being used, you also stop being needed. And if your identity was built on being needed, the silence that follows can feel like withdrawal. That's what no one warns you about. Not the guilt, not the anger. The quiet ache of having nothing urgent to fix. The first few days, I kept checking my phone like a reflex. Like a request might come through and I'd have to respond. I'd open my banking app without thinking. I'd look for transfers that weren't there. I'd hear a notification sound and my chest would tighten before my brain even caught up. That's what long-term stress does. It rewires you. You don't relax just because the threat is gone. You relax when your nervous system finally believes it. And that takes time. There were moments I almost went back. Not because I missed the situation, because I missed the clarity. When you're inside a broken system, your purpose is simple. Survive the next request. Pay the next bill. Prevent the next meltdown. It's exhausting, but it's straightforward. After you leave, you have to learn a new kind of purpose. You have to learn what you want when no one is demanding it. You have to learn what your life looks like when it isn't organized around someone else's comfort. That's a different skill set. And it can feel unfamiliar enough to make you question your decision. My mom called twice that first week. The first message was soft. She said she missed me. She said she didn't understand why I was being distant. The second message was sharper. She said I was being dramatic. She said I was tearing the family apart. I listened to both. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't feel anything, because I recognized the pattern. When a system loses its main support, it panics. It reaches for whatever tool has worked before. Affection, shame, fear, obligation. It's not proof you made the wrong choice. It's proof you mattered more than they admitted. I want you to understand this if you've ever cut off a toxic dynamic and then felt worse for a while. That dip doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're detoxing. You're stepping out of a role that kept you busy enough to avoid yourself. And now you have to meet the part of you that was neglected. The part that never got to be a person, only a function. I started noticing the smaller losses. I missed the structure of family dinners, even when the conversations were transactional. I missed knowing what was happening on the ranch, even though it wasn't mine. I missed the illusion that if I just tried harder, things could become normal. Illusions are comforting, even when they're killing you. The first time I sat alone in my apartment and realized no one could demand anything from me, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed. Like I had stepped outside without armor, because in my family, being needed was my armor. It kept me valuable. It kept me safe from being dismissed. And now I had to build value in a different way, not through sacrifice, through choice. So I started small. I made coffee without rushing. I paid my own bills on time and felt what it was like to spend money without fear. I cleaned my space slowly, not to prevent criticism, but to create calm. I went on a walk and realized the air in my lungs felt different when I wasn't bracing for the next conflict. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive. It was boring in the best way. And then, one night, I slept through my phone buzzing. I didn't hear it. I didn't wake up in panic. I didn't check it until morning. When I looked at the screen, it was just a notification from an app I'd forgotten to turn off. No request, no emergency, no crisis. And I realized my body had done something my mind couldn't force. It had started to believe I was safe. That's what comes after freedom. Not constant happiness, not a perfect life. Just a slow return to yourself. A life where your peace isn't rented, where your boundaries don't need approval, where your worth isn't measured by what you absorb. If you're in that in-between stage right now, the stage where leaving feels quiet and strange and you keep wondering if you overreacted, listen to me. You're not weak for missing what hurt you. You're human. And the fact that it feels empty doesn't mean you should go back. It means you finally have space. And space is where you build a life that belongs to you. A month after everything shifted, I drove back to the ranch once. Not to reconcile, not to beg, not to prove a point. I went because my name was still attached to things I didn't agree to. That's what people misunderstand about boundaries. They think boundaries are emotional. Most boundaries are administrative. I parked on the gravel like I used to. The same dust, the same sun glare off the garage door, the same quiet that used to feel familiar. My dad met me outside. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask how I'd been. He asked, "Are you really doing this?" That question wasn't about love. It was about control. I handed him a folder, printed documents, highlighted lines, screenshots with dates. He flipped through the pages and his face tightened. Not with remorse, with calculation. My mom came out a minute later, wiping her hands on a dish towel like she'd been interrupted in the middle of something important. She looked at the folder like it was an insult. "This is what you've become," she said. "Paperwork." I didn't argue with her tone. I didn't defend my character. I just said, "These are my records," because that's what it comes down to. When someone is used to winning through emotion, facts feel like betrayal. Logan stayed inside. That was predictable. Golden children don't show up when consequences finally enter the room. My dad cleared his throat and said something about how families handle things privately. My mom said we could talk about it if I stopped making it official. And right there, standing in the same driveway where I'd spent years being convenient, I understood the final lesson. They weren't asking for peace. They were asking for immunity. And adulthood is the moment you stop granting immunity to people who refuse responsibility. I didn't come to punish them. I came to separate love from liability. Because you can love someone and still refuse to let them sign your name. You can care about someone and still insist on structure. That's what growing up looks like when you've been raised in a system that confuses family with entitlement. My dad looked down at the paperwork again, and for the first time, his voice softened. "What do you want?" he asked. I didn't say, "I want you to understand." I didn't say, "I want an apology." I said, "I want my name cleared. I want the accounts corrected. And I want everything in writing." Silence followed. Not the dramatic kind, the administrative kind, the kind where everyone realizes the rules have changed. Because the truth is, order isn't restored with shouting. It's restored when someone stops absorbing the chaos. That's the part I want you to take with you from this story. Real power doesn't come from being loud. It doesn't come from being the favorite. It doesn't come from being right in a moral argument. Real power comes from accumulation, from the small, boring decisions you make when no one is watching. Keeping your records, knowing your numbers, understanding your options, building your life in a way that doesn't require permission. People ask me if it felt like a victory. It didn't. It felt like alignment, like my choices finally matched my values. And that's what order is. Not revenge, not humiliation, just alignment. If you're listening to this and you're in a situation where you've been trained to stay quiet, let me tell you something that might sound strange. Your silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's discipline. Sometimes it's you holding your tongue because you're gathering facts, saving screenshots, noting dates, learning the system. And if that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. If you're quietly documenting what's happening, if you're building a record, building a plan, building a way out, you're not cowardly. You're maturing. You're choosing structure over drama. You're choosing truth over noise. And when you finally speak, you won't need to scream. Because the evidence will speak first. If this story hit close to home, drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are right now. I want to know you're here. And if you're trying to rebuild your life in silence, you're not alone. Like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories like this.